For the last 72 hours, the entire world has been arguing about Donald Trump buying an island of ice. But while you were distracted by the headlines, a death sentence was just signed for a different country. Ukraine, $27 billion in weapons. Blocked, not by Russia, not by battlefield losses, but by a diplomatic crisis over Greenland that has paralyzed the very alliance sworn to defend democracy. And here's what nobody is telling you. Russian officials are celebrating. Putin's envoy just declared the collapse of the Transatlantic Union while meeting with Trump's team in Davos. European leaders who were finalizing security guarantees for Ukraine 3 days ago are now tearing up their notes and writing tariff retaliation packages instead. This isn't about real estate. This is about severing Ukraine's lifeline while the world watches a show. By the end of this investigation, you will understand why one senior European diplomat told the Financial Times they cannot trust American security promises anymore. You will see the exact mechanism by which weapons shipments to Kyiv have stalled. And you will discover why Ukraine now faces an impossible choice between the United States and Europe that could determine whether it survives 2026. Because what looks like Donald Trump's impulsive obsession with an Arctic island is actually a strategic masterclass in alliance destruction. Whether intentional or accidental, it is working exactly as Moscow planned. Let me show you the trap. January 6, 2026. Paris. 30 Western nations gather for a summit with one singular purpose: finalizing robust, legally binding security guarantees for Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron calls it a significant step toward ending Russia's invasion. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky praises the detailed understanding of the architecture that will protect his nation after a ceasefire. The mood is cautiously optimistic. After years of war, Ukraine's allies are finally building a framework that could survive beyond individual presidencies and political cycles. 72 hours later, that framework is in ruins. January 17th. Donald Trump announces escalating tariffs against 8 NATO allies. 10% starting February 1st, 25% by June 1st. The condition? The complete and total purchase of Greenland. The targeted nations are Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. These aren't random countries. They represent the core of Ukraine's European support coalition. The impact is immediate. The Financial Times reports a complete agenda collapse. 3 days ago, EU leaders were preparing to spend the week in Davos, convincing Trump to promise security guarantees to post-war Ukraine. Today, they wake wondering whether they can even trust his promises to them. Then comes the quote that captures everything. A senior EU diplomat, speaking anonymously because the truth is too damaging to say publicly, tells the Financial Times, "How can you sit down across the table with this guy and discuss his security guarantees to Ukraine? You can't trust him unless you suspend reality." Read that again. A European diplomat is saying that American security guarantees require suspending reality. This is the existential crisis now paralyzing European support for Kyiv. If the United States president threatens military action and economic warfare against a NATO ally to seize territory, what value do American security guarantees to Ukraine actually hold? The question has no good answer, which is precisely why European leaders are asking it instead of shipping Patriot missiles. The EU Emergency Summit, hastily convened for Thursday, January 22nd in Brussels, was originally conceived to coordinate Ukraine's security guarantees. Diplomats confirm the agenda has been consumed entirely by Greenland tariff defense strategies. A meeting of national security advisors in Davos, initially scheduled to discuss Ukraine, pivoted completely to Greenland after Trump's tariff announcement. EU leaders preparing to engage with Trump at the World Economic Forum are tearing up their notes on Ukraine and replacing them with what one diplomat described as carrots and sticks. Proposals for de-escalation alongside retaliatory tariff packages totaling €93 billion, $108 billion in tariffs. That's the counter-threat Europe is preparing while Ukraine runs out of ammunition. This diplomatic paralysis has direct, measurable consequences on the battlefield. Ukraine requires at least $27 billion in military equipment from non-European Union sources in 2026. Primarily American systems the EU cannot produce or match. The shortlist is brutally specific. Patriot air defense systems, and PAC-3 interceptors, the only weapons capable of stopping Russian ballistic missiles, F-16 munitions, and spare parts. Critical for sustaining Ukraine's first Western fighter jet fleet, advanced signals intelligence and satellite systems, capabilities no European nation can replicate at scale. Germany and the Netherlands have argued that up to 25% of the EU's €60 billion defense allocation for Ukraine should go to purchasing these American systems. But as one analysis states bluntly, it is quite difficult to imagine that any EU country will make new financial contributions to PURL, effectively subsidizing the U.S. defense industry. At the same moment, President Trump is pitching Greenland's annexation and imposing punitive tariffs on them. PURL, NATO's prioritized Ukraine requirements list, the mechanism allowing European nations to buy American weapons for Ukraine. It has become, in the words of Ukrainian policy analysts, largely doomed by the Greenland crisis. As of December 2025, only $4 billion had been pledged by NATO allies, a fraction of Ukraine's needs. France and Italy had already refused participation due to budget constraints. The Greenland tariff war has now eliminated any remaining political will to fund American arms purchases. The EU's new €90 billion loan package includes a bi-European clause prioritizing purchases from EU manufacturers. While presented as industrial policy, it is also an acknowledgement of reality. European governments will not subsidize American defense contractors while Trump threatens their sovereignty. For Ukraine, caught between American technology it cannot access and European production it cannot wait for, the Greenland crisis is a supply chain catastrophe. Europe's SAMP-T air defense system has not produced a single new unit since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. And in battlefield conditions, it has proven less effective against ballistic missiles than American PAC-3 interceptors. So while European diplomats spiral into crisis management over Greenland, who is celebrating? Moscow. Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's special envoy and CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. He distilled the Kremlin's reaction into 5 gleeful words: collapse of the Transatlantic Union. Finally, something actually worth discussing in Davos. This is not a fringe propagandist. This is Putin's point man on Ukraine negotiations, the architect of the controversial 28-point peace plan widely seen as Ukraine's capitulation, a fixture at high-level US-Russia talks. And his presence at Davos this week represents something extraordinary. The World Economic Forum froze formal ties with Russian entities in March 2022 and has not invited Russian officials since the invasion began. Dmitriev's appearance represents Moscow's confidence that the geopolitical winds have shifted decisively in their favor. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed that Dmitriev is meeting with the U.S. delegation. Specifically, Steve Witkoff, Trump's Ukraine envoy, and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. Let that sink in. While European allies are excluded from meaningful Ukraine discussions, Putin's envoy gets White House access. On social media, Dmitriev has been relentless in mocking European leaders. He sarcastically dubbed German Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil Rambo and warned Europe not to provoke your daddy, a reference to Trump after NATO allies sent symbolic troop deployments to Greenland. He predicted that Europe will cave in, the US will get Greenland, transatlantic unity may be somewhat restored. A statement dripping with contempt for European sovereignty. Then there's Rodion Myroshnik, the Russian Foreign Ministry's ambassador at large. He stated on January 19th that Vladimir Zelensky hated Greenland-related discussions as those were distracting Europeans from the Ukraine conflict. The quote, reported by TASS, is significant precisely because it is true. Zelensky has warned publicly that distractions during a full-scale war are dangerous. He stated, "We are in a full-scale war. There is a specific aggressor and specific victims. The focus must be solely on pressuring Russia and strengthening Ukraine. There are no other tools to end the war." But Myroshnik's observation is not sympathetic analysis. It is weaponized schadenfreude. By highlighting Zelensky's frustration, the Kremlin signals that it understands the strategic value of the Greenland distraction and has no intention of letting the West refocus on Ukraine. The narrative on Russian state television has been unambiguous. The Greenland crisis represents the death of NATO. On the NTV program hosted by Roman Babayan, Political analyst Sergei Stankiewicz declared that Trump's Greenland bid signifies the United States, inflicting a severe blow to NATO, as one member state is seizing territory that legitimately belongs to another NATO member, disregarding protests and international law. Babayan responded enthusiastically, "It's marvelous. Let them handle Greenland. I believe this is advantageous for us." Moskovsky Komsomolets, a Moscow tabloid, ran the headline, "Europe is utterly bewildered, and frankly, it's delightful to observe this." The government newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta wrote that the old world is eager to retain Greenland for itself, even at the cost of NATO's disintegration. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev welcomed Trump's threats as evidence of collapsing Atlantic solidarity. He wrote, "The U.S. is preparing to attack Greenland, choosing the island itself rather than some kind of Atlantic solidarity. This is not typical Russian bluster. It is a coordinated messaging campaign designed to demoralize European publics, exploit transatlantic divisions, and create the perception that NATO is already dead. The Kremlin's goal is simple. If European citizens believe their alliance with America is finished, political support for costly Ukraine aid will evaporate. And the $27 billion shortfall is not just a number. It is the difference between Ukrainian air defenses intercepting Russian ballistic missiles and those missiles striking apartment buildings in Kyiv. It is the difference between F-16s maintaining air superiority and Russian bombers operating with impunity. It is the difference between Ukraine surviving 2026 and Ukraine collapsing under the weight of Western distraction. Which brings us to the final element of the trap, the impossible choice. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez delivered what may be the most prophetic statement of the crisis in an interview on January 18, 2026. Invasion by the United States of this territory would make Vladimir Putin the happiest person in the world. Why? Because it would legitimize his invasion of Ukraine. If the United States were to use force in Greenland, it would be a fatal blow to NATO. Putin would have double reason to rejoice. A fatal blow to NATO, not hyperbole. Analysis. Trump has explicitly refused to rule out using military force to acquire Greenland. His tariff threats represent economic warfare against allies, a coercive tactic that, if successful, establishes a precedent indistinguishable from Russia's approach to its neighbors. The Guardian reported that Europe's tacit consent to Washington's forced acquisition of Greenland would send a disastrous signal about the EU as a geopolitical actor and its commitment to Ukraine. If European leaders cannot defend Danish sovereignty from an American president's real estate ambitions, how can they credibly promise to defend Ukrainian sovereignty from Russian military conquest? Ukraine now faces a dilemma no nation should confront. Choose between the United States, its primary weapons supplier, and Europe, its geographic neighbor and future political home. A comprehensive analysis published on January 18th framed the trap explicitly. Ukrainian leadership likely never envisaged a scenario where they would be forced to choose between the United States and Europe, or that their concessions would only lead to demands for further concessions to keep the U.S. on our side. The analysis concluded with a statement that should alarm anyone concerned about European security. Ukraine is undeniably a European nation. It will side with Europe, not only because the EU represents its most reliable future partners, but because Kyiv has no moral arguments to do otherwise. Therefore, thinking about security guarantees without the United States, albeit painful and difficult to imagine, needs to be considered as the main planning scenario. The main planning scenario. Europe is actively planning for a post-American security architecture, not as a theoretical exercise, as the primary operational assumption. For decades, the transatlantic alliance rested on the belief that America would defend Europe against Russian aggression. That belief is now operationally void. The World Economic Forum in Davos was supposed to be the venue for breakthrough announcements on Ukraine's security guarantees. Instead, it has become a geopolitical hostage situation. Trump arrived Wednesday, January 21st, to deliver a special address. His delegation includes Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Ukraine envoy Steve Witkoff. Trump planned a reception for global CEOs following his speech. Business deals, not security commitments. Kirill Dmitriev is meeting with Witkoff and Kushner, the architects of Trump's Ukraine peace strategy. While European allies are excluded from meaningful Ukraine discussions, Putin's envoy gets White House access. Despite Zelensky's request for a bilateral meeting, the White House did not respond positively. Zelensky ultimately canceled his Davos appearance after a massive Russian missile attack on Kyiv forced him to remain in the capital to oversee emergency responses. He stated publicly that any meeting with the U.S. must produce concrete results aimed at supporting Ukraine, and that discussions with America should result in concrete measures to reinforce Ukraine or advance the end of the war. The message could not be clearer. Ukraine will not participate in performative diplomacy while its cities burn and its Western support structure collapses. EU leaders attending Davos, including von der Leyen, Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, are focused on tariff negotiations rather than Ukraine strategy. Norwegian and German leaders have sought meetings with Trump to discuss the dispute over Greenland. Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, warned that China and Russia must be reveling in this, noting that they are the ones who benefit from divisions among allies. An EU Council spokesperson confirmed that intensive consultations are ongoing, but emphasized engagement over escalation. The priority is no longer Ukrainian victory. It is damage control on transatlantic relations. So let's be clear about who is winning and who is losing. The Kremlin has achieved in 2 weeks what 4 years of war could not. The fracturing of Western unity and the sidelining of Ukraine from strategic discussions about its own survival. Moscow's gains are tangible. Diplomatic paralysis. European leaders consumed by tariff crisis, not Ukraine aid. Weapons blockade. PURL mechanism stalled. $27 billion shortfall unaddressed. Narrative victory. Russian state media successfully framing NATO collapse. Negotiating leverage. Dmitriev meeting U.S. officials while Zelensky is excluded. Legitimization. If Trump seizes Greenland, Russia's Ukraine annexation becomes normalized. Putin has not fired a single additional shot or spent an extra ruble. Trump has done the work for him. Ukraine's losses are existential. $27 billion in critical American systems trapped in diplomatic limbo. Security guarantee collapse. The Paris summit achievements gutted within 72 hours. Forced choice. Must align with Europe against America, losing primary weapons supplier. Attention deficit. Greenland dominates headlines while Russian missiles strike Kyiv. Morale crisis. If NATO cannot defend Denmark, how can it defend Ukraine? Zelensky's frustration was evident when he warned that the Greenland situation diverts attention during a full-scale war. The focus must be solely on pressuring Russia and strengthening Ukraine. There are no other tools to end the war. But the diversion is not a bug. It is the feature, and Ukraine is running out of time. What appears on the surface as Donald Trump's impulsive obsession with Greenland is, in effect, a strategic masterclass in alliance destruction. The mechanism is elegant in its brutality. Threaten NATO allies' sovereignty. European leaders defend Denmark. Trump imposes tariffs. European budget strained. PURL contributions stall. Ukraine weapons shortfall grows. EU shifts focus to tariff retaliation. Ukraine security guarantees delayed. Russian attacks continue. Transatlantic trust collapses. European defense planning excludes US. Ukraine forced to choose. The final element, the impossible choice, is the trap's killing blow. Ukraine cannot afford to alienate Europe, its future political home, or America, its current weapons supplier. Yet the Greenland crisis forces exactly that choice. Kirill Dmitriev's celebration of the collapse of the Transatlantic Union was not premature. It was observational. Pedro Sanchez's warning that a U.S. move on Greenland would make Putin the happiest man in the world was not hyperbole. It was analysis. And Rodion Myroshnik's claim that Zelensky hated Greenland discussions was not propaganda. It was reporting. Because while the world watches Trump's Greenland theater, Ukraine is losing the war. Not on the battlefield, but in the Brussels conference rooms where weapons shipments are approved, the Davos meeting rooms where security guarantees are negotiated, and the NATO capitals where political will is measured in budget allocations. The $27 billion shortfall is the difference between Ukrainian air defenses intercepting Russian ballistic missiles and those missiles striking apartment buildings. It is the difference between F-16s maintaining air superiority and Russian bombers operating with impunity. It is the difference between Ukraine surviving 2026 and Ukraine collapsing. On Thursday, January 22nd, EU leaders will convene their emergency summit in Brussels. The agenda will focus on Greenland tariffs, anti-coercion instrument activation, and retaliatory measures against the United States. The words Ukraine and security guarantees will appear in official statements, accompanied by assurances that support remains unwavering. But the weapons will not ship. The PURL contributions will not materialize. And the Russian celebration in Moscow will continue. Because Trump has built a trap, and Ukraine is caught inside it. So ask yourself this question. Is the Greenland crisis just a negotiation tactic for an island? Or is it the architecture of abandonment? The systematic dismantling of Ukraine's Western support while the world argues about ice? Because if you believe this is about real estate, you're watching the show, not the strategy. And while you were distracted, the death sentence was already signed. Subscribe if you want the geopolitical truth the mainstream media is too afraid to tell you. Because in 2026, the lies are louder than ever. But the facts are still here, waiting to be uncovered.